Welcome back, everyone. So I'm so glad to welcome everyone to our first panel for this conference. And what we are going to aim to do here with this first panel is really kind of lay out some of the broader themes and dynamics around China's growing attention and strategic focus to the Global South at this moment where we're clearly at an inflection point in the global order. Look a bit at what are China's goals, how China's going about achieving those goals, and what we think is the likelihood that China will achieve those goals. What will its success be? And we could not have a better group to kick us off here with this first panel. So let me introduce them very briefly. I won't go through their full bios. Those will be on your kind of virtual program. And they're very impressive bios, but I'm just going to give a quick introduction of each of our panelists now. We have on the screen here Bilahari Kausakan, Chairman of the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. We have next to me Paul Nantulia, a Research Associate at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at National Defense University. Nadège Roland is a Distinguished Fellow in China Studies at the National Bureau of Asian Research. And on the screen, joining us from Beijing, is Michael Schumann, who's a non-resident senior fellow with the Global China Hub, as well as a contributing writer for The Atlantic magazine. So I should just say at the outset here that we will take audience questions for the last 10 minutes of our panel today. And audience members can submit questions via askac.org, askac.org. So we'll get to that at the end, and please feel free to jump in and ask questions. So what we're going to do now is just jump into our moderated discussion for this rest of the conference. We won't be having opening remarks. We just want to have kind of a free-flowing conversation. And so what I want to start off with is really a question for you, Nadège, maybe just very broadly, why is Beijing so interested in the Global South to begin with?
Well, thank you very much for having me today. It's great to be here and to focus on such important questions for a couple of days. Well, I think that China's interest in the Global South and what we call the Global South is not new. It dates back the decolonization movement. Over time, it has evolved, obviously, and during the reform and opening period, China's interest was more focused on economic development and getting resources, raw material from the developing world, and also using it as a way to asphyxiate Taiwan's diplomatic space. But for the past 10 years, really, what has changed is a vision that's much more strategic, much more comprehensive, that is looking at multi-domains, starting with the economic one, an interest in developing the markets for its companies, in the diplomatic area, trying to build coalitions with developing countries in international institutions to align with China's political and diplomatic interests, and politically, kind of partnering or shaping the way the countries in the developing world are helping China, maybe shaping norms on the global stage. So it's a much more strategic vision where Beijing looks at these countries as a vast area in which it can expand its power, expand its influence. And I should maybe start also by saying that domestically, China doesn't talk about the Global South. It talks about developing countries and the emerging world. And that tells you how I think the vision is about this emerging force on the international scene that will basically upend the current order, that it's dominated by Western countries, and being replaced with that emerging force with China as its leader and composed by non-Western countries. So it's the West and the non-Western world. That's the bifocal of their interest.
And as Josh kind of discussed at the outset of the conference, I mean, this is not a new dynamic, right, in terms of China's bid to lead the Global South, the G77. This is kind of a return to that dynamic. Is
right. Yeah, and I mean, of course, during the 50s, throughout the 70s, the interest was somehow similar in the sense that it was a global vision, something that was supposed to upend the world order. But that's the only thing that is very similar in that way. Today, of course, it's not about communist revolution. It's more about those like malleable and flexible coalitions to reduce the influence of Western, what Beijing thinks is a Western-led order, Western concepts, and to instead replace it with ways to vision for a world that's very different, and in which Beijing thinks that the developing world can be partners and allies.
So I think it's worth at this point digging into this question that you touched on, that Assistant Secretary Crittenbrink touched on, which is this notion of the global South. Nobody likes that terminology, but we don't seem to have a better one. So maybe Bilahari, I'll turn to you. What is this creature we're calling the global South? Is this a useful terminology? Is there a better way to be thinking about this? Because I think it's something that's on everyone's mind as we kick off our conference.
Well, that's a very good question. And the short answer is there is no such creature. We use what we now call the global South. I think from political correctness, we used to call the third world. We used to call the less developed countries. We used to call the developing countries. We used to call them we can call it the non-Western world. All right? It really represents a certain mood. A mood which is partly a hangover from the colonial experience, a sense of being disadvantaged economically and politically in the global system, certain resentment at the inequalities of the system, a certain irritation with the sanctimoniousness of certain aspects of Western diplomacy, particularly European diplomacy, but also American, and a sense that Western definitions of norms are not the only definition of norms. But I think it's also important, and it takes form in organizations such as the Non-Aligned Movement, the G77, and most recently, BRICS. But this mood and these forums, I wouldn't even call them organizations, do not create any cohesion of interest, except perhaps at a very high level of generality. So high and so general that it really prescribes nothing very practical in terms of policy. The Non-Aligned Movement, the G77, they have a certain relevance in international organizations like the UN, but I wouldn't overstate the case. Perhaps because I did some evil things in a previous life, I spent a lot of my youth as a young diplomat working in the Non-Aligned Movement and in the G77, I can tell you there is very little cohesion in them. It represents a mood. Now that mood should be taken seriously. And China, if insofar as it has any success in cultivating, we'll call it the global South for convenience, is because it takes that mood, or it pretends to take that mood seriously. And if its successes are perhaps even more so the result of the West, Europe, North America not taking that mood seriously enough. I think what Nadine said at the beginning is all correct. But I think one of the reasons China is making a concerted effort, not new, but a renewed effort to cultivate the global South is really because its policies towards the developed countries, the global North, if you like, towards North America, towards Europe, towards Japan, have been failures. I can't think of any country in the so-called global North, and in fact, many countries in the global South that are not without concerns about anxieties about one aspect or another of Chinese behavior. Now, I think that's an important, they also have concerns about Western behavior, one aspect or the other. But I think it's important to understand that these generalities like global South, third world, developing world, conceal a multiplicity of interests. And that multiplicity is much more important or as important as the mood. It doesn't mean that these countries however resentful they may be about different aspects of Western policy, are going to drink deeply of Chinese Kool-Aid. They have their own interests, they have their own agencies. Some of those interests, maybe even many of those interests, will align with China's interests, but not all of them. Some will align with Western interests, and some will not align with either Chinese or Western interests. And that is certainly very clear in my part of the world, Southeast Asia. But I think it's clear, generally speaking, in this amorphous animal we call the Global South.
Add on to that and talk a little bit about, as China has grown richer, more powerful, how have its interests in the Global South changed, and what impact is that having on those relationships it's having across this creature we're calling the Global South?
Yeah, thanks, David. Well, as we've already mentioned, China likes to see itself as, or present itself as, kind of a fellow traveler with the Global South. This is another developing country, poor country that was a victim of Western imperialism and therefore has a shared experience and therefore has shared interests. But I think that's becoming less and less true. The Chinese economy is only a little bit smaller than the entire rest of the Global South combined. And China is becoming an incredibly dominant player within the emerging world. It's, for many countries in the Global South, China is already the largest trading partner. China is the largest official bilateral creditor. It is a major creditor for many low-income countries, some cases the largest. This is creating, well, in the old days when I was in college, I won't tell you when that was, but we would have called this a kind of a first world to third world relationship. That in some ways isn't all that different between the relationship between the North and the South. And in many ways, the Chinese have not been particularly generous, dominant partners. When you look at the way that they're handling, for example, the debt restructurings for low-income countries, where they've been extremely reluctant to give these countries significant debt relief. So I think as this power balance has shifted, this is opening divisions between China and the rest of the Global South, and potential points of disagreement and conflict. And my sense, actually, though, sitting here in Beijing, is that the Chinese government actually likes this unequal relationship on a certain level, because my sense is that the Chinese don't really want to see a multilateral Global South. They want to leave the Global South. And they want the Global South to fall in behind China and support Chinese interests and Chinese ambitions on the global stage. And you can see this in the way that China deals with the Global South in terms of it's always China offering the initiatives, China offering the programs, and other countries are expected to kind of sign up, whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative. And because of the way that this unequal relationship is developing, I think what you're also seeing is the emergence of other voices within the Global South that don't see it in their interests to have China lead the Global South in a way that it intends. You see this also, for example, with India, which is trying to exploit some of these new tensions and divisions that China is facing within the Global South. So I think going forward, in terms of what Chinese aims are globally, in terms of remaking the global order in this geopolitical confrontation with the United States and the West, that this changing nature of the relationship between China within the global South and this role within the Global South is going to be increasingly important.
So it's fair to say that you would say, and I think others, that China now views the relationship with the Global South generally, as kind of fundamental and central to its geostrategic objectives.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
I would not agree with that. I think from a diplomatic point of view, yes, but substantively, no. I'm sorry, Michael, I didn't need to interrupt you.
No, that's okay. No, my view on this is that the Chinese policy towards the Global South, I think, is becoming increasingly consumed, like many aspects of Chinese policy, with this global competition with the United States. And it's starting, Beijing is starting to see its relations with the Global South more and more in that context. And I think because of that, the Chinese government is actually, I think, intending on kind of weaponizing the Global South against the U.S. and its allies, to use the Global South as a foundation to promote its own strategic aims, its own vision for a new global order. And I think that too is, I think, also going to be creating problems for China within the Global South. As has already been mentioned, the most members of the Global South really don't want to take sides between the U.S. and China. They don't want to take sides with the U.S. against China, and they certainly don't want to take sides with China against the United States, because they benefit from both of these relationships. So I think as China sees the Global South increasingly in these geopolitical terms, and sees the Global South as more and more as a foundation to support its own interests and power on the global stage, that this is going to create more divisions within the Global South as well.
They don't, I mean, China doesn't need the developing world to take sides necessarily, I think they're very much aware that each of them have their own interests and their own agency. It just needs to have their support in some areas, but some areas that are actually very consequential for the shape that the global order is going to have in the future. And so it's not necessarily that it's going to be, two separate camps with the West isolated on one hand and China leading those developing countries on the other. It's more fluid and complex than that. But it doesn't mean that using those relationships, using that increasing influence that China has economically, politically, in terms of security, in terms of governance in those countries, it cannot sort of steer them in a direction that is more beneficial to China's own interests and isolate and reduce the influence of Western countries and universal values. So I think that's the broad picture here. And I don't think that China's economic slowdown is going to change that. To the contrary, because China is going to feel more sort of more cornered in a way, maybe more like with reduced options. It's going to use more a diversity of tools for influence that are cheaper than just investing in big infrastructure projects. We've seen that already happening with the Belt and Road. It started to decline back in 2015 already, those big ticket infrastructure projects. It was never the objective of the Belt and Road anyway. So investing in other areas that are more, shaping governance, training, and I think that Paul can talk about that in other areas that are not as costly but very consequential for the future shape of the world.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, a lot of subjects that have just been brought up that I want to come back to, especially the impact of the struggling economy and the demographic changes. But yes, I want to bring Paul in here and talk a little bit about the training, the security aspects here in terms of China's interests and engagement around the Global South and how big a factor that is in the way that China's looking at its engagement in the developing world.
Well, thank you, David, and it's great to be on a panel again with Nadège, and there are many other colleagues that I've worked with in this room for many years. Let me just associate myself with remarks that Nadège made earlier, which is this term, the Global South. If you talk to African diplomats, they don't use the term Global South at all. They'll talk about developing countries, developing regions, regions that were once colonized, regions that feel not well represented in international multilateral institutions, regions that basically constitute the vast majority of the world's population, but have very little voting power in institutions like the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank, right? That's the language that you're going to hear from African diplomats. Now, Global South, yes, it will be used in different ways, but it's really not seen as a fundamental term of art when it comes to African countries. And I think we saw this in the recent non-aligned movement and the Group of 77 summit, which I was accredited to observe. And when you listened to the discussions in those rooms, and you listened to what the delegates were talking about, there was very little usage of this term Global South. People talked about Group of 77, Group of 24, which is a group within the G77 that defends African interests inside the IMF with the Secretariat in New York. Those are the sorts of conversations that were taking place there. But in terms of the security picture, in terms of China's security vision, I would say perhaps four things in this region, in Africa, in Latin America in particular. One is to socialize security concepts. So the Chinese defense establishment believes that it has, that the military, China's military and its military influence around the world has grown to such a level that China has a legitimate interest in promoting, its visions and its ideologies of security and security management. And I think that is fundamental. There are quite a number of platforms, I wouldn't call them institutions, defense dialogues that have developed, the SEO, the African China Defense Forum, similar defense forums with Latin America, which are younger, because I think the African ones are much older, having been established, between 2000 and 2006. In Latin America, these were only established in 2014. But nevertheless, you see these as a mirror image, right? Quite a number of platforms that have been established by the National Defense University in Beijing, which gathers African, Latin American, Asian officers once, twice, 3 times every year, to discuss global concerns, global problems, but from an alternative kind of perspective. So I think this is key. The second is to build alternative defense dialogues. And again, these are not institutions. I mean, if we look at the Xinjiang Forum, that took place 2 years ago, for the first time, African countries were invited to participate in it. And it was hosted by, the PLA, National Defense University, and the dean of that university, one of the things he said, which was very interesting, he said that these forums provide an opportunity for African, Latin American, Asian countries, giving them a space to discuss their issues frankly and freely, right? These are the terms that he used, as sort of like, he didn't mention the Shangri-La dialogue, but you could see that that's where it was heading. So again, there's that sense of trying to construct different or alternative defense dialogues, which I think is consistent with the larger policy. China does have a vision of international order, does have views of how the international system is organized, how it should be organized, and a lot of those views, whether we like it or not, do dovetail with the statements released, the policies of the non-aligned movement and all these other organizations. If one looks at the non-aligned movement outcome document that was released after the Kampala meeting, you can clearly see, in these different areas that they're looking at, you can see that there's a lot of alignment with some of these positions that we're talking about. The other element is to market professional military education. Now, this is a major area of Chinese engagement, probably the most important, I would say, on the military side. I mean, if we look at on the African side, for instance, from 2015 or 16 or thereabout, when African countries demanded for the inclusion They demanded that, the peace and security, need to be included as part of the FOCAC mechanism, the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation. There was agency from the African side. It was not an imposition from China, right? And China was very reluctant to get into that space because China was very aware of the sorts of relationships that the United States military, for instance, had built with different African countries. So from that period, we've seen that the Chinese side educates more African officers than any other industrialized country. And this becomes extremely important. And if you look at the reorganization of the Chinese candidate officer schools and officer academies, there's been that reorganization. African countries now access over half of those, right? The Nanjing Military Academy, the PLA and its different colleges and so on. We could say the same thing about Latin America. So I think this is a major low cost, but high impact. It's really high impact in terms of exposing foreign officers to the Chinese way of doing things. Now, as to whether those concepts are actually adapted and applied, that's a different story. I've worked on a number of projects that has been looking at how African officers perceive, the education that they receive in Chinese institutions. Then I think the fourth one, after the PME element, which is very general to developing countries, is reinforcing other lines of effort. So the People's Liberation Army has been socialized and schooled and raised to see itself as part of the architecture of the Communist Party of China. It's a political army, right? It serves the CCP. It does not serve the constitution. It does not serve the nation. It is an army. It's the backbone of the Chinese Communist Party. So PLA officers are political cadres in their own right, right? And we see this in the strategic guidance, right, that the Chinese release regularly after 4 or 5 years or so. This concept that the PLA or the Chinese military establishment is supporting larger objectives, cultural, ideological, the party-to-party work, right? You do have uniformed officers that participate in party-to-party work with African political parties, for instance, and that sort of thing. And Latin America, the same thing can be said about Latin America and countries like Pakistan, in South Asia. So it's not just purely military, right? It is much broader than that, and I tend to term this as a blended security approach, where the PLA also discusses the Belt and Road process, it discusses culture, it discusses Confucius Institutes. There's a lot of training that Confucius Institutes are doing with African militaries, for instance, right? It's not military, but it is being done, with a strategic kind of framing in mind. So I think, David, these would be the 4 or 5 issues that I would say characterize Chinese security engagements within developing countries. Yeah.
Well, that was fantastic. Thank you, Paul. I think, and you put so much out there in terms of not just what China is offering countries in terms of military education and engagement, but pointing out how this ties into other dynamics that China, in the ways in which China is engaging across the developing world, the BRI and all these other aspects. And also, I think, importantly, noting that this is not something China is imposing on countries, that in many cases, at least in the Africa context, you were saying, there's agency here and there's a demand signal for this engagement.
Little bits of agency. I mean, there's pockets. There's variation. I mean, some countries negotiate better than others. Some countries get better deals with China than others. But the point I'm making is that there is a level of agency. So the tendency to look at African countries as simply supplicants, right, who basically do China's bidding. I mean, the story is a little bit more nuanced than that. Yeah.
I think this is a good way to transition into the question of, what is it that China is offering many developing countries that is working, that they want, that they appreciate, and is China ultimately, at this moment, getting what it wants out of its increased attention to the global South and the developing world? So I don't know if anyone wants to jump in. Maybe I'll turn to Michael to kick us off if you want to answer that question. Is China getting what it wants out of the global South right now? Is it working what it's doing?
I think it's getting some of what it wants out of the global South. I mean, I think that the Chinese see the global South as a huge future economic opportunity that they're doing a very good job of capitalizing on. The Belt and Road Initiative was very much about developing new bonds of trade, finance, technology between China and the developing world. And and Chinese companies see the developing world as future markets, future consumers to buy their products. The Chinese are challenging Japan right now for the title of world's largest car exporter. Those cars are not going to the United States, they're going to Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America. So in that way, the Chinese are getting what they want. I also think they're getting a fair degree of diplomatic and political support. The Chinese see the global South as being more receptive to its ideas about reforming global governance and some of its political and ideological principles, the kind of things enshrined in the Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative. These are very much targeted at the global South. You can see Chinese benefiting from support from members of the global South in promoting its ideas and initiatives at the international institutions like the United Nations. But they're not getting everything that they want, and I think it's going forward things will be more difficult. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think as the Chinese see their relation with the global South more and more in terms of geopolitical competition with the West, I think they may find themselves somewhat disappointed. As we've all reiterated at this point, there is no such thing as a global South that has one common interest as multiple interests. I think the Chinese would like to see as many members of the global South more or less fall in line behind China and behind Chinese interests. And increasingly, I think that's what the Chinese want. You see that, for example, in my opinion, the recent expansion of the BRICS and how that played out. You can see it at the recent Belt and Road Forum in October in Beijing, where I think the Chinese increasingly want to see the members of the global South act to a certain extent as client states or supportive states for China's own ambitions on the global stage. And I think that's where, going forward, the Chinese may find themselves a bit disappointed.
Bilahari, did you want to jump in here?
Well, I just want to jump in to support what Michael just said and add to it. I think the Chinese, insofar as they see the global South in geopolitical terms, in terms of its competition with the US, is almost bound to be disappointed because it's not a cohesive group. When somebody earlier mentioned, I can't remember who, that most of the countries that make up the global South, and certainly those in Southeast Asia and Asia, always say we do not wish to choose between the US and China. Now, what do we really mean by that? What we really mean by that is not that we want to do nothing, lay low, and hope not to be noticed. What we mean is that we want to have the agency to take an eclectic approach to our interests. Some of our interests may align with the US or Europe, some may align with China, and some may align with neither of these major powers. But it is our interest, even if it aligns with one or another. That's, I think, an important point to bear in mind. I think China plays the game in international multilateral institutions like the UN much better. It understands the mood, or professes to understand the mood that constitutes the global South better than the West. It avoids what I would call sanctimonious diplomacy, insisting that its interpretation of values is the only possible interpretation of values, and the conceit that one interpretation of values needs to be universal. The idea of universality of norms is a myth. It doesn't exist except, again, as I said, at a very high level of generality that prescribes nothing practical. So I think it is a game, it's a diplomatic game that China plays, not badly, but it will not get what it wants if what it wants is some weight on its side vis-a-vis the US or vis-a-vis the West generally, because the weight isn't there. and even for China, its most important interest, economic interest, where are its most important markets? Perhaps one day they will be in the global south, and perhaps they're already there in certain domains like, EVs, for example, automobiles. They are quite good automobiles. You can see them in Southeast Asia, so why should we not buy them, right? But their own interests, their most important interests in technology and so on, are in fact with the global north. And that is true of countries in the south. India is certainly a very important member of the global south, is an important member of the non-aligned movement and so on, but does its interest align with China? I don't think so. Indonesia, some of Indonesia's interests align with China, but many do not. In fact, I think there are two things that have become more and more evident over the last 10 years, at least in my part of the world. One, there is a growing awareness that in order to deal with either China or the United States effectively, you have to deal with both simultaneously. Secondly, there is a growing sense that we have concerns about both certain aspects of Chinese behavior and certain aspects of American behavior. And you put this all together, what it means? What it means is countries are going to look for maximum flexibility to align their interests in any particular, in any direction they think is most advantageous to them. Nobody is going to line up all their interests across all domains in one direction or another. In that sense, there is a new world order already. It's not a binary world anymore. And there is a very strong tendency, particularly in the United States and Europe, to look at the world in binary terms. But most of the countries in the global south, I dare say, do not look at the world that way.
And one would think maybe that this kind of dynamic you're talking about, where countries, in a negative sense perhaps, because it's a lot to deal with, have to think about dealing with the United States and China simultaneously. But there's also benefits to that, as there was during the Cold War, in terms of playing the United States and China off one another and gaining benefits from that, perhaps.
No, I don't think it's so simple. I don't understand why you said, if I heard you correctly, saying it's difficult to deal with both the US and China simultaneously. I think it's very natural to do that. It's not a binary choice. And I think this idea that you play one against the other, that's a mug's game, okay? You'll get into trouble. The better way to conceive of it, and even during the US-Soviet Cold War, people who tried to play that game eventually tripped themselves up,
Fair enough. Fair enough.
It doesn't mean you have to. What a better way to conceptualize this is to think of your own interests and follow your interests in whichever direction they take you. Some will take you in the direction of China, some in the United States, some in neither direction, some India or Africa or Europe. It's what I call dynamic multipolarity. You're going to have a central axis of US-China relations because that is certainly the most important relationship in the world. But around that, you're going to have coalitions forming and reforming themselves around different interests. You already see it, actually, in a nascent form, in Asia at least.
Well, I welcome others to jump in here, but I think this comes back a little bit to what you were saying, Nadej, as well, in terms of China's perspective, which is, and I'll try to paraphrase, but please correct me, that you were saying it's not that China necessarily wants countries to choose, or that there needs to be this new order that China is setting up, but that in kind of achieving what Bilahari was just kind of laying out there in terms of this much more multipolar order in which countries have this choice, China has already, to some extent, succeeded in some of its aims.
Yeah, I would think so. And it's like, I believe that Beijing's view is very binary, for sure. It's there's only one obstacle between its objective and where it is now. Its objective of being a risen power on the global stage, and where it is now, it's the West. It's the Western influence. So in a binary zero-sum perspective, as the Beijing government has, it can be difficult to, I mean, there's no other way to than isolating the West. It's like this. It's your power grows, my power grows, your power is declining, so it's very zero-sum. And in that game, if I can put it that way, countries in the developing and emerging world are part of putting the numbers on the shifting weight of power. So this is when this idea of the democratization of international relations come in, because the multiplicity of countries that are non-Western, if you just look at the list on the, just by numbers, one country, one vote, it's very important for China to be able to work with these countries in order to achieve this shift in the in the balance of power. I mean, this is very sort of basic, but it's I think this is the main objective. And yes, I think in some issues that are more important from Beijing's perspective than others, those like flexible, malleable coalitions that we're all starting to see emerging might be very consequential. And sometimes you don't need 160 countries on your side to be able to, shape the direction that the world is taking. You can have 54 that vote with you on, the fact that the camps in Xinjiang are not a violation of human rights. And is that consequential or not? Well, I believe it is. So it's it is flexible, and there's a lot of dynamic, and we're all saying the same thing. It's not like these countries are pawns in the hands of Beijing, but Beijing certainly sees them as such, and so it's a very binary vision for what the world order looks like. It's a rejection of the existing one, and it's trying to shape it in a very different direction.
Right, and I want to come back to a point you made earlier in terms of the capacity to be able to shape the order in a way that fits China's interests better, and that is the point about what is the impact of China's slowing economy, which I think we all agree now is not going to be returning anytime soon to the galloping growth of the past. You already mentioned, Nadej, the kind of pullback from the massive kind of infrastructure projects of the past, although it's not entirely gone, but certainly a pullback on financing with the Belt and Road Initiative. And you talked a little bit about other ways in which China will achieve influence, but I'm curious from you and also others, do you think that both with this economic slowdown and with the demographic changes and then the shrinking of China's population that it looks like we're going to be witnessing over the next coming decades, is it really the case that China is going to continue to be able to have the kind of influence and achieve the kinds of things it's trying to achieve through its engagement in the developing world, or is this going to really fundamentally, ultimately shape the way countries view the value of a relationship with China?
I think what we're going to see is a Belt and Road. We're already seeing Belt and Road 2.0, and at some point we'll see Belt and Road 3.0. The Belt and Road is not going to go away. I don't think it was designed to be an economic. Yes, it's doing a lot of economic work in terms of infrastructure, but that's not what the Belt and Road is. The Belt and Road fundamentally is an ideological vision. It's an ideological vision that is telling other parts of the world that, look, the world is not binary, and international arrangements can be shaped in different ways. And this is what China is. This is the vision that China is offering. I think that's what the BRI is. The physical elements of the Belt and Road, the connectivity, the infrastructure, and so on, yes, those are there. Those are physical manifestations of this concept. But fundamentally, the Belt and Road is fundamentally an idea. And I think it's going to live on. Now, certainly there's less funding. We've already seen this with African countries, right? The Kenya government has been trying to get China to extend the standard gauge railway from Naivasha to the Ugandan border. I mean, these are very, very tough negotiations. It's not very clear whether the Chinese will do that. The Tanzanian and the Zambian governments have been trying to get China to revive the TAZARA, the Tanzania-Zambia rail. And they're not the only ones. We see this in Peru. We see it in Nicaragua. They're all, basically these governments have become much tighter in terms of the way they're trying to get the Chinese government to fund different initiatives in the context of an economic slowdown. So I think we're going to see that. We're going to see less. I think it's going to be much more targeted. I think what has happened is the Belt and Road has encountered problems along the way, problems in terms of environmental impacts, complaints that have been made by civil society and so on. So it's adjusting as it moves along, but I don't think it's going to disappear. Secondly, I think that Belt and Road program it's part of a much larger effort, right? So, there's culture, the Confucius Institutes that I mentioned earlier. There's the political party-to-party training. There's the Luban workshops, which even, which recruit, which touch high school students and so on. It's such a wide array of domains in which China is engaging that I don't think that influence will. It may change somewhat, but I don't think that the Chinese government puts all its eggs in one basket, so to speak. I think it's a multiplicity of engagement, and whether it is succeeding or not is another question altogether. But I think on the diplomatic front, as Ambassador Bilahari was talking about earlier, I think there's been some success. If you look at the African voting behavior, for instance, on issues of Xinjiang, the national security law in Hong Kong, on Taiwan, right? It's very, very clear, right, which way African countries are voting. When the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, when she made her visit to Taiwan, if you look at the condemnations that came in, hard and fast, a lot of them came from African countries, right? So on the diplomatic side, I think there's some wins. I don't think China is going to win everywhere, and I think the Chinese understand this. But I think it's in terms of volume, in terms of what you put out there. And if you can get maybe 20 or 30%, that's fine. So I think that is really the strategy. It's really a multi-domain operation. And that's how I see the Belt and Road. It's not just an infrastructure building initiative. Right. So I think responding to the Belt and Road should not just be about infrastructure. I think it should be about something much more fundamental. And that's really the power of ideas.
That's really helpful, and I think that will be the subject of many of our panels to come over the next 2 days, is what is the nature of the Belt and Road and how to respond to it. Michael or Bilahari, anything to add on those points? And then we'll turn to Sorry.
Okay, so Michael, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead first. You're in Beijing, so you are at the top of the hierarchy, so you should go there.
Okay, well, I would argue that as the Chinese economy struggles, that China is going to be even more aggressive in promoting its leadership of the global South. That I think you can make a case that the Chinese leadership has come to recognize that they may not be able to overtake the United States economically. But the goal of overtaking the United States and the global order remains the same. So how does China do that? If it's not going to see the kind of economic gains going forward that its leadership had expected and hoped for. And I think the way that the Chinese are going to do that is that they're going to try to basically overcome the United States in aggregate, which is trying to build a coalition of support mainly within the global South, and use that as a foundation to basically overwhelm the U.S. by numbers. And so I think the slowing economy actually makes the global South more important to China economically, of course, but also diplomatically in pursuing its geopolitical aims.
Okay, let me jump in here now. I think, first of all, on the BRI, I tend to agree it is not just, it is a vision. I wouldn't even call it an idea. It is a vision, a very ambitious vision. But ambition and vision are just that, ambition and vision. That does not mean they are not reality. And I tend to see the Global South, the BRI, as a collection of projects, a very disparate collection of projects, taken for different reasons, wrapped up in a slogan, and presented as a strategy. I actually see very little strategic cohesion in it. Secondly, I agree with Michael that, and I think Nadine said it too, we all said it too, the numbers game is important. But they're important only in certain specific and rather narrow domains. Votes in the UN, votes in the Human Rights Council, that kind of thing. Yeah, it has a certain importance, which we should not completely dismiss, but neither should we exaggerate that importance. I agree with Michael that as China's economy slows, and we shouldn't exaggerate that, right? Last year they said 5.2, is it 5.2 or 5.3? And let's say discount, let's round it out to 5, and that's not the same as in the past. It will never be the same in the past, but that's about adding one Australia to the Chinese economy. And that's not inconsequential, even slowing down. But I think it's wrong to draw too close a correlation between influence and economic weight. Of course, it has a role, but I think insofar as China has influence in the Global South in that numbers game, which is important only in specific and rather narrow domains, it is not just due to its economic weight, it's not just due to its ability to build infrastructure projects, it's due basically to exploiting that mood I talked about from the beginning, and as much due to the failures of Western diplomacy in understanding and trying to work with that mood, rather than lecturing to the Global South all the time. My last point is this, there is a very fundamental paradox in Chinese approach to the world. They talk very eloquently and at great length about democratization of international relations of the world. But that comes from a perspective that is instinctively hierarchical. The Chinese view of the world is hierarchical. And when they talk about democratization, they really mean the replacement of one hierarchy with another, with themselves, of course, at the apex. Yeah. I think we shouldn't forget that. And I don't think many people in the Global South are as foolish or as naive as some people, not everybody, not this group certainly, but some people in the West seem to think that we are all in the Global South. We are either so naive as not to know our own interests, or also irredeemably corrupt as to sell our heritage for a mess of pottage. It's not so, And I have often reminded it is true that governance is an issue in many parts of the Global South, including in Southeast Asia, right? And the Chinese exploit that. Let's be frank about that. But I've always reminded my Chinese friends not to forget one thing. Even the most corrupt person can be a nationalist. This is not a contradiction. And therefore, they have a sense of their own agency and their own interests. And there's one very big country in my part of the world, Indonesia. I've said it in public, so I'll say it again. Indonesia has taken money from the Soviet Union. It has taken money from Maoist China. It has taken money from Japan, from Europe, from the United States. And it's always gone its own way. So I think this is something that I've told my Chinese friends to bear in mind, because they are being disappointed here and there. They will face further disappointments. Disappointment is one of the characteristics of being a global power and trying to be a global player. They're just beginning to learn that.
Thank you for that. We could probably spend a whole nother hour talking about Indonesia and where things are headed now there with its relationship with China. We only have a couple minutes left. I have one question that I wanted to ask from the audience. We've talked about Africa, we've talked about Indonesia, we haven't talked about South Asia much. There's a question here about India, and India's the question is what does it mean for India, all of the things we're discussing here, which is a part of the BRICS, a part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. What does all of this mean in terms of India's approach to China and India's response to China's bid to lead the Global South? That was my, I slightly shifted the question, but this is from Senga Tsering. Anyone want to jump in on the role of India?
Okay, I'll jump in on this. I think it's become very clear that New Delhi has woken to the danger of a global South dominated by China. These are countries, two countries that don't get along on their own bilateral interests, but also have extremely different worldviews, extremely different views about where what kind of global governance there should be. Very different relationships with the West, different relationships within the Global South. And I think it's clear from Prime Minister Modi's enhanced diplomacy within the Global South, and we saw that, and more broadly, we saw his role at the G20 last year, that he has decided that India has to take more action to challenge China and to challenge China's aim to be the leader of the Global South. And I think this is important because, as a couple of people have already discussed, we're too prone to see the world in bilateral terms. That this is that the world has become a U.S.-China confrontation, or a confrontation between China and the West. It's much more complicated than that, and India's emergence as a more assertive power within the Global South is just I think the most prominent example of that. And China's increasing a large role within the Global South is actually going to be driving that dynamic, as other countries with other visions will want to get their voices out and expand their own influence to push back China's influence within the Global South.
Great, thanks, Michael. Any other thoughts there?
Yeah, I think when we look at India, I mean, India is always the big elephant in the room in these sorts of discussions. But if you look at the relationship with Africa, which I'll focus on, India has a very, very, very special relationship with Africa and with African countries that goes way back. In fact, the conventional thinking goes as follows: that Chinese senior leadership visit African countries more than any other industrialized country. That may be true. It's highly institutionalized within the Chinese state. But India, when you look at the foreign ministers of India from independence to today, there's actually been much more engagement with African leaderships than China, for instance. China came in much late in the day. And so India has a very, very multifaceted approach in Africa. Obviously, a huge Indian diaspora in Africa that supports that to some extent. But what I find very interesting, and which goes back to the discussion of dynamic multipolarity, India and China on the African continent, and if it's like countries like Seychelles and the Maldives, there'll be some element of rivalry there that will be clear, right? But on the rest of the African continent, Indian diplomats do not talk about China, and Chinese diplomats do not talk about India when they're in African spaces. And it's very interesting. And one, sort of like very visible manifestation of that at the BRIC summit, this BRIC summit that was held in South Africa, you had Modi and Xi Jinping together, right? That sends a message. And I mean, within African think tanks and within the broader African public opinion, the rivalry between India and China is actually not really discussed. And that's because of the way the two countries engage. They both understand that they've got different levels of engagement with the continent, but there's almost a sense that they tend to de-emphasize their rivalry when engaging African audiences. So I think it's a much more complex and nuanced picture But certainly India is a major player on the continent. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and I'm sure this is a subject we will dig into even more in our Africa panel coming up next, as well as our panel on Asia. I think this was a fantastic way to kick off the conference. We're already at time. We covered a whole range of different issues here around China's shifting approach to the global south and the impact that it's having, the role of the BRI, the role of security relationships, the geostrategic competition with the United States. So really a great way to lay out some of those issues that we're gonna cover in more depth, I think, or at least from different angles over the next 2 days. So I want to thank our panel. Please, everyone, stay seated as we transition to our next panel on Africa. Thank you.